It is task shifting. We all think it's multitasking, but if you're working
Hmm.
on a brief or studying for an exam or, writing, doing some research at your law firm and you constantly check your email or get a ping on your phone, that draws your attention away from the work that you were in. So you're not doing those two things at the same time. You're breaking your attention, shifting to something
Hmm.
else. And then when you try to go back to the task that required your deep focus, you've lost time and you have to spend some mental energy getting back to that point where you were deeply engaged.
Welcome back to the Thriving Lawyers Podcast. In this week's episode, join Michael Kahn for an enlightening and hopeful interview with Shalani George, a professor of legal writing at Suffolk University Law School.
Welcome back to the Thriving Lawyers Podcast. This is Michael Kahn, one half of Real Time Creative Learning Experiences. My partner is Chris Osborne. He is a practicing lawyer. I am a former lawyer and currently a licensed professional counselor. And I do a couple days a week of counseling for the Lawyer Assistance Program in Vancouver, BC, where I am currently situated. We have a wonderful guest today, Shalini George. She is a professor at Suffolk University, a law professor, professor of legal writing. And in fact, I found out about Shalini when I'm a podcast junkie. I heard her on a podcast. And I, after that, bought her book. Shalini, I don't know if I think I did tell you I bought your book.
That's good to
And
know. And it's always good to know that somebody's listening to those podcasts.
right, I know, I know. Well, it was a great interview. Got me interested enough to buy your book, and I've been
Great.
reading your book and haven't read the whole thing yet, but it's really helpful. But let me just give a quick two-sentence biography about Shalini, and then I'll let her add on to that. She is a legal writing professor at Suffolk University, and her scholarship focuses in the areas of lawyer well-being, mindfulness, and the cognitive science of learning. She's the author of, this is a book that I'm reading right now, The Law Student's Guide to Doing Well and Being Well. And even though it says law students, the information in there is applicable to lawyers, not just those who are in law school. So that is why I bought the book. I knew it was going to be applicable to my work with lawyers. And she's also the co-author of Mindful Lawyering, the Key to Creative Problem Solving, and law review articles on distraction and the cognitive science of learning and why law students need mindfulness training. And finally, and lastly, this is important, she also was recently appointed to the Institute for Wellbeing in Law's Research and Scholarship Committee. I've done some work with the Institute for Wellbeing in Law, and they are really doing some excellent work around the area of well-being for lawyers and thriving for lawyers. So, Shalini, how did I do with that? Do you want to add some things to your bio?
Well, that was great, Michael. And let me just first of all thank you for having me here today to talk about a topic that I know we both care very deeply about. And it's always great to have a place to talk through some of these issues. You did a great job with my bio. I'll add just a couple of things. I was recently named to the executive committee of the double ALS Balance and Wellbeing and Legal Education section. So that's law professors, a section of law professors, all of whom are interested in looking for balance and well-being in legal education. And I'm doing a lot of work at Suffolk on these issues too, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. And just as an aside, I think my book could be titled Anyone's Guide to Doing
Hmm.
Well and Being Well.
That's true.
And
Not just lawyers or law
not just
students.
lawyers. It could be
That's right.
there was a joke in my family as I was writing it that there were different editions that were going to come out. I have two boys in college, and I thought I could do the college student's guide to doing well
Hmm.
and being well. Um, but I do have an academic book publisher, and they wanted to make sure that the
Hmm.
audience knew that I was a law professor. But anyway, thank you for that great introduction, and I really look forward to talking more today about the topic of thriving.
Yeah, thank you. And just for our listeners, and actually for me too, AALS.
Hmm.
What does that stand for?
That is the American Association of Law Schools.
Ah,
And that is an
okay.
organization of thousands of law professors across the country, and literally thousands. I wish I knew off the top of my head how many, but it is the
Mm,
primary way that law professors around the country organize. And we have a yearly conference in January, but it's divided, the membership is divided into sections based on topics. So, for example, there's
mhm,
a legal writing and reasoning section, there's a teaching methods section, a contract law, animal law, you name it. But one of the newer sections is the section called Balance and Wellbeing in Legal Education. So that is a place where I find like minded professors, all of whom are really working on ways that we can bring elements of well-being and balance into the law school so that we hopefully set students up for better chance of thriving and maintaining their legal careers.
yeah, I mean, you're starting in law school would be ideal, wouldn't it? Because to some of the folks that I see in my counseling, in my lawyer assistants counseling, are folks who have bad habits to break,
Right.
and starting in law school with good habits would be helpful, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I give a talk about my book, or in this, I am teaching a class at Suffolk that I'd love to talk about a little bit too. But
Hmm.
I take the lawyer well-being graphic, the dimensions
Yeah.
of lawyer well-being, and I try to have a conversation with students about the fact that for a long time nobody talked about any of the dimensions other than how many hours do you work.
Hmm.
And I tell them, I know none of you have come to law school hoping to be burnt out and unhappy, with
Right.
mental health issues one day. Nobody strives for that, and yet that's what's happening to a lot of us. So just even if I can't, even if we can't necessarily create healthy habits, but even a discussion about why we should
Hmm.
have healthy habits
Yeah,
is a step, I think, in the right direction.
I agree. And the graphic that you're mentioning was from the Wellbeing Task Force report.
Right.
And for those of you who haven't seen it, it defines lawyer well-being as a quote continuous process in which lawyers strive for thriving in each dimension of their lives, and it lists six different dimensions: emotional, physical, social, spiritual, intellectual, and occupational. And Shalini, as we discussed in email, I guess yesterday, the Oregon Attorney Assistance Program, um, as far as I know, um, they I think they're the first ones who did that, adding cultural well-being
Hmm.
to to the list of dimensions, what I think was a good add.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And so it's a really helpful idea and graphic that there are these various dimensions, because it's a recognition that we're not automatons who go to work and bill, 12 or 14 hours and have nothing else that we need to think about. It is giving, I think, permission for law students and lawyers to understand that there are other aspects of our beings that if we attend to, we can actually perform, I would argue, perform better and more productively. And that's why we should be thinking about nurturing and really understanding the other dimensions as well.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's just talk. We can come back to some of this, but um, Shalini, why don't you share your journey uh, in- to as becoming a lawyer, and then eventually becoming a law professor, and and then I might interrupt at times as you're sharing this if I have a specific question.
Sure. Um, so, I could go on and on, but I'm going to try and give you just the highlights. As I was growing up, Michael and I talked about this before we started our recording today. I am the children of immigrants. My parents came here from India. And they came, my father came to get his master's in engineering at a time when the United States was very eagerly welcoming doctors and engineers from Asia. And as I was growing up, I was generally given two options. I could choose to be a doctor or I could choose to be an engineer. Unfortunately, I was not terribly good at math or science. So I shouldn't say that. I was all right at them. I just didn't love it. I found myself very interested in the law, and so when I made the suggestion that maybe law school would be an option, my parents, I think, were very excited to see me excited about it. So I went to law school straight from undergrad, which I don't really recommend to people, but that's what I did. Um, and my interest in law was always in litigation, and so that's what I pursued from the very beginning in law school, interning and clerking for the Superior Court in Massachusetts, and then I worked for a small plaintiff's employment litigation firm. Actually, I clerked for the Superior Court for a year. I did some plaintiff's work for about 2 years, and then I worked at an insurance defense firm for 7 years. So, really heavily in litigation, discovery, depositions, summary judgment motions, and trials. So, in total, I worked for about 10 or 11 years. I had an aha moment, though, at one point where my father passed away when I was on maternity leave with my second child, and I had a little bit of time to kind of stop and take a breath and think about whether I was actually doing things that I enjoyed doing, that made me happy. I had had a enlightening conversation with my father before he passed away, in which he reminded me that I had always really liked teaching. And so I
Hmm.
started thinking about kind of combining my interest in law with teaching, and it took me about a year and a half, but I found this position at Suffolk and teaching legal writing because I thought that's something I was qualified to do, and I have been there ever since.
And Shalini, can you hear me right now?
I can.
Okay, good. I was having just a momentary issue with my microphone, and I
Oh, okay. I hear you
wanted to
fine.
make sure that. Okay, great. So, so your dad, if sorry, I was a touch distracted with the
Mm.
microphone for a second, but your dad passed. Did you say it was 20 years ago?
Yeah. Yes. I had just had my younger son, who's going to be 20 in July. So it's
Hmm.
coming up on 20 years in
Hmm.
September. He had not been well for a few years, so it was not a surprise at the time, but it was difficult. I had a 2-year-old and an
Yeah.
infant when he passed. So my firm was asking me all the time, when was I coming back to work? Uh,
Hmm.
I was, I was told by another female partner that she only took 6 weeks off for maternity leave, and she wasn't telling me that I should only take 6 weeks
Hmm.
off. But when did I
Right.
think I would be coming back to work?
Right.
Um, so that really helped me, I think, realize that I was not dying to get back to work, and that there were some things that I
Hmm.
had not been enjoying tremendously, and it was an opportunity for me to take a little bit of a course correction.
Yeah. 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 That's interesting that you said that. Certainly, and we talked a little bit before the interview today that loss is something that we all experience, and it can have an effect. It can affect us all differently.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of work with grief and loss in my work now as a counselor for LAP, and also when I was in private practice. But it sounds like it certainly, understandably, had an impact on you and on your path.
It absolutely did, and it's something really I still think about sometimes when I'm working with young law students. There are some difficult things that happen when you work in the world of billable hours, and so it
Yeah.
was it was hard for me to manage. Two young children, my father not being well, maternity leave that coincides with bereavement leave, which means I didn't really get one or the other fully. And it's like, but you still have to bill. So, those are some
Right.
of the cold hard facts, I think, for a lot of lawyers. And
Hmm.
I think, hopefully culturally, the way that law is practiced needs to change a little bit, because that sort of framework does not allow for those other dimensions of well-being that we were talking about just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, and you also gave an example of the culture of some law firms. A lot of law firms, unfortunately, was the not not so subtle message that you're wanted back at work
Right.
quickly.
Right.
And to not here in Canada, gosh, I think each parent can have 6 months leave after they have a child. We have friends who are a couple here just had a baby, and the mom took 6 months off, and then she went back to work, and the dad now is taking 6 months off.
Well, I think we're the United States is one of the one of the countries in the world with the worst,
Yeah,
parental leave policies. We could obviously talk a whole hour about that, but
yeah,
it poses challenges, obviously, for
yeah.
young attorneys and particularly for young female attorneys because the bulk of things still fall on them, no matter
Hmm.
how much things change.
Right, and we did touch on that in our discussions before this. The the practicing law, going to law school, being a law student, that's all stressful, and
Hmm.
it's even more stressful for law students, for lawyers who are in marginalized groups, people of
Yes.
color, women. As an example, is sexual orientation, although it's not as obvious,
Right.
marginalization certainly that can impact people's experiences in law school and law firms and ultimately well-being. Did you want to
Absolutely.
speak to that at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know that there's anything more critical, actually,
Hmm.
to somebody being able to fulfill their full potential than being your full self in any particular role. So when I went to law school, and I'll give away my age here, in the early 90s, there were not a lot of Indian lawyers. There were certainly not a lot of Indian law students. I had people say things to me in interviews like, "Oh, you seem really great, but I just wonder how people will react if we bring somebody like you
Hmm.
in for a second interview." And I never knew if that was because I was a woman, because I was a person of color, like what really was the issue.
Hmm. Or
I
both.
had, yeah, or both. I had people say, I'll never forget somebody who asked me, how'd you get to be a lawyer? Aren't your people usually doctors and engineers?
Hmm.
And now we have maybe an understanding that when you say something like your people, you're really
Yeah,
saying, you're not one of our people.
that's right.
So I'm glad to know that things are changing, and that we're having these conversations, and that there is a recognition. Certainly, the ABA is explicitly recognizing the importance of information, training, education on cross cultural competency and on racism. So these are all positive steps. They don't happen overnight, and I don't know that anybody has the magical answer as to, you can't wave a wand and make everybody culturally competent.
Right.
But again, I think just having the conversations and this recognition that it is something for us to talk about, is a really positive first step.
Agreed.
Um,
Self awareness
yes.
certainly helps, and that's where, to me, and we're going off in lots of different directions here, but that's okay. Um, you talk about mindfulness in your book, and what an important tool and resource that is, and way of life, really. And
Hmm.
mindfulness is one of the best tools to become more aware of how you are with people in general, but particularly people who are different than you,
Right.
and how your behaviors, your thoughts, your reactions to
Right.
folks who are different than you, right?
Right. I mean, I think the power of mindfulness, at least the way that I practice and explain it to my students, is in slowing down and taking a moment to be intentional and conscious, very consciously make choices about our language or how we react to people or situations. And, you know, there can be sometimes some hesitation that, mindfulness is some sort of mystical or religious or, something that doesn't belong in law school. But I would argue the exact opposite, that as lawyers, who are supposed to be rational, logical thinkers, that it probably makes sense for us to give our brains a chance to kind of slow down and assess the situation, choose our words carefully, understand maybe the background of a situation that we are dealing with so that we can better address these sorts of issues rather than leaving them unsaid. I think people tend to think if you don't talk about race or you don't
Right.
talk about culture or you don't talk about pronouns, that it just means that everybody's fine. And I think that's not true. So I used to hear people say things like, well, I don't see race, or, I think of
Right.
you as just being like everybody else. But nobody's just like everybody else. And so when we
Right.
say that, we're ignoring a whole part of who we are. That's
Well,
why I
when you're
really,
not seeing, oh, go
yeah.
ahead, finish
No,
your
I was
thought.
just going to say that's why I think the inclusion of the cultural well-being as a
Hmm.
dimension is an explicit recognition that there is that this part of us, be it it's not always about your color necessarily, but your culture, what you eat, what you enjoy listening to,
That's
where
right.
you spend your time. All of that is wrapped into who we are as people.
Yeah, and back to the idea of being colorblind or gender blind.
Right.
That's that means if you first of all, it's impossible.
Right. It's
Um, but
nonsense.
yeah, but second of all, if you do strive for that, then you also don't. You're not paying attention to the racism or the sexism that's going on. If you're not paying attention to race or gender, then you're also being um, you're blind to some of the racism and sexism that's going on
Right.
and other
Right.
isms.
Right. Right. You're pretending that
Hmm.
they don't exist. And not
Hmm.
acknowledging them does not mean they don't exist.
Right. So
Right.
let's talk just a little bit more about law school,
Sure.
even though it gives me the shivers to think about. No, truly, I'm joking. I actually enjoyed law school. I know that's maybe kind of crazy for some folks to or to think I'm uh, not thinking clearly to say that, but I did enjoy law school. I enjoyed the intellectual stimulation, and I actually had a blast. I met some
Mhm.
wonderful people. It was certainly hard, especially the first year,
Mhm.
and not sure I'd want to do it again.
Right.
But I did enjoy it. In fact, I enjoyed law school more than practicing law.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, but but certainly you've been a professor now for I think you said 18 years. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know if you said it in our interview right now, but I know you told me earlier.
Around
Um,
that much. Yeah.
yeah. So, what are you noticing? Are you noticing any difference in the law students that are coming in and how, first, and how they're coming in and how they're dealing with stress, how they're managing stress? And is there anything that the law school, well, Suffolk in particular, but in general, law schools
Mhm.
and you
Mhm.
doing differently in your teaching approach? I know that's a big question. I ask you a lot of stuff there, so feel
Yeah.
free to start
Yeah.
wherever you want.
There's a few different things that I'd like to talk about
Sure.
there. So I first started researching the process of learning and distraction. Like that's where about 10, 11 years ago, I had been teaching for 6 or 7 years at that point, and I think that was around the advent of the iPhone. And
Mm,
we really changed the way that we take in and process information. And I started doing a little bit of research because I was constantly complaining about my students. Like I felt they were distracted. I thought they were, on their laptops, not doing what they were supposed to do in class. I felt like maybe, they were more interested in their phones than they were in their work at times. But I felt a little bit like a curmudgeonly old law professor who just was, making these statements, but I didn't really know if there was legitimately something for me to be concerned about. So, the one of the law review articles that you mentioned earlier is called "Teaching the
hmm
Smartphone Generation," And that law review article was my chance, like the research for that was my chance to understand a little bit about the brain, how we take in information, how we process information, and what effect does distraction and multitasking have on those abilities. And it's not good. I think we all know multitasking is not good. I could
Right.
drink a cup of coffee while I talk to you because drinking the cup of coffee doesn't require my attention, but I certainly can't do something else that requires my attention well while I'm trying
You
to
can't do it
focus.
well. Yeah, exactly.
No, you can do
Can't
it,
do it
and
well.
a lot of us try, but we're not going to perform our best when we do that. And
No,
so
I think you said, by the way, in
yep.
your I listened to your one of your podcasts earlier. You called it task shifting,
Yeah,
right?
it is
Not
task.
multitasking.
Yeah, it is task shifting. We all think it's multitasking, but if you're working
Hmm.
on a brief or studying for an exam or, writing, doing some research at your law firm and you constantly check your email or get a ping on your phone, that draws your attention away from the work that you were in. So you're not doing those two things at the same time. You're breaking your attention, shifting to something
Hmm.
else. And then when you try to go back to the task that required your deep focus, you've lost time and you have to spend some mental energy getting back to that point where you were deeply engaged and your brain was making these connections that you wanted it to make and you were kind of moving the information along. So yeah, we do a lot of task switching. I thought students were doing a lot of it, and so I wanted to work on that law review article to educate myself about what was happening, and also to get some ideas about what we could do to change that. And that's where the law review article on mindfulness came from. If I had identified a problem of distraction, I then wanted to think about what the solution was, and the antidote to distraction is mindfulness. So if we're
Hmm.
constantly and multitasking, I had this strange idea. What happens if we monotask? Like what happens if you actually just do one thing at a time? And we're not used to it, and our brains don't want to do that. Our brains crave novelty, and we feed our brains novelty. So it takes
Well, it's so
practice.
easy now, of course.
Oh yeah,
Um,
everything at
and I
the tip of your fingers, right?
and I know in your book you talked about, and I told you that one of the issues that comes up with a lot of my clients is procrastination,
Yes,
and one of the things you recommend for folks who are either procrastinating or having trouble getting their work done, easily distracted, is to put their phone in another room, like
yes,
literally remove it from their space.
yes.
I think that's a good suggestion.
It seems so simple, and yet
Hmm.
it's very powerful. So research does show that when you have your phone, and this is something, so you asked, I'll just wrap this back into your last question
Yeah,
too.
please.
You asked about how I've changed things, or what have I incorporated into teaching. And these are things I try to educate my students about, that just having a phone near you, whether you're looking at it or not, your attention is going to your phone. So students think if it's in their bag or it's turned off or it's face down, they're like, but I'm not looking at my phone. But you keep thinking, right? Oh, I'm not going to
Yeah,
look at my phone. And so that's the second that you're not engaged. As I tell them, like with me, who knows what you're going to, what amazing and fascinating thing I'm about to tell you in
that's right.
class, and you're going to miss it because you're
That's
thinking,
right.
did my mom text me? So,
Well, listen, I had that exact thing happen to me when I was questioning my microphone. Is it working?
right,
I missed what you said
right,
when you were talking, and you were talking about the very personal thing about your dad. So definitely
right,
not ideal.
right,
Not ideal to
right.
miss anything that you said, but certainly not that portion of it. So that was a great
Well,
example of me
it's a,
being not. Now I wasn't,
but you didn't do it
intentionally.
intentionally. Yeah,
I didn't, but it
exactly.
was a good example though of being distracted, right?
Well, yes, the effective distraction for
Yes.
sure. And
Hmm.
so these are ways in which I have, I think, started to change my teaching in my legal writing class for sure. And I actually create classes where students have to bring something in to work on, and there's no technology, no phones, no laptops, nothing.
Oh wow.
And I walk them through a process that I write about in the book of creating the proper physical and mental space in order to be productive. So it's very strange
Mhm.
for them, but they have to bring in a hard copy of something, which is the first like shock.
Right.
So they have to bring in a hard copy, and they're allowed to have that piece of paper and a writing utensil on their desk. And I have them put everything else away.
I
So
love
there's
it.
literally nothing else that they can think about. And
Wow.
then I do a few minutes of guided meditative breathing with them so that we kind of
Hmm.
calm ourselves. We
And
identify,
how do they react to that when the new students, when you
you
have
know,
them
yeah,
both things?
yeah, Michael, you'd be surprised. They love it. They beg me for more.
Mhm.
They want to
Mm.
know, like,
Mhm.
they want to do it more. The first few
Mhm.
times I did it in class, maybe there are a couple of skeptics, but by the time, and usually we do 20 or 25 minutes of work. But the most important part of that process is the debrief when it's over. And when I say, so, what did you accomplish? They have accomplished like 2 hour, what they thought would take them 2 hours, they've done in 20 or 25 minutes
Well, that's the
because,
key, isn't it? That
right,
result really
right,
will
right.
encourage them to do that more.
Or they will tell me they
Mhm.
see things that they hadn't seen. Like they're like, I read
Mm.
this over before. I thought I had edited it. This is something I do
Mhm.
quite often before a memo is due. They think it's in really good shape, but then they find when they really are deeply focused, they find mistakes they hadn't seen, they find typos, they find a gap in their analysis. So that debrief is really valuable. And then I can explain to them why this process was so successful. And then
Yeah.
the really funny key is I say, you can do this on your own. It's like, you could really
That's
do
right.
this. But they
Yeah.
beg me for more. So I
Hmm.
think that tells you something.
That's
So
pretty cool. I'm sure you share that with your colleagues
I
there
do.
about it. Have any of them implemented some of what you do?
Yes, actually. So we have
Mhm.
something that we call a writing retreat. We do it once a semester, and we get faculty support for it so that we can get some food and beverages and things like that. And we have students
Mhm.
come for a 2 or 3 hour block of time. And it's the exact same thing. They have to bring whatever work they need to do, but we get them started. The first step, actually, I should go back and say, I usually have them set a goal for themselves for the work session. So in these writing retreats, and they bring in whatever it is they want to work on, and we have them write down their goal for the day. And I just talk very briefly about how much more likely we are to accomplish something if we do it with a goal or intention in mind. We do that thing where we clear off physically things that are competing for our attention. I lead them through the meditative breathing. We work for about 50 to 55 minutes, and then they take a break, and we talk
Mhm.
about the importance of that too. You have to take a break. Your brain can't focus for some unlimited amount of time. And we get the same feedback from these students. They want me to do it once a week, and I have to kind of say, you can create these conditions on
Mhm.
your own as well. So that's one way in which the broader community at the law school is involved. Some of the other professors who I teach with do exactly my type of exercise in class.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Thriving Lawyers Podcast. We love hearing from our loyal listeners, so please feel free to email us any questions, comments, suggested topics, or guest recommendations at the following address: feedback@thrivinglawyerspodcast.com. The Thriving Lawyers Podcast is brought to you by Real Time Creative Learning Experiences, a national provider of continuing legal education and professional development programs that leave participants engaged, encouraged, and equipped to pursue meaningful and sustainable change in their practices, their lives, and the organizations they work in. And by Osborne Conflict Resolution, your experienced guides through the uncharted terrain of business and family law disputes, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Thriving Lawyers Podcast.